This is a test of the captioning service. We're reaching the top of the hour at 9:00 a.m. Eastern Time. This is the duplication of benefits session. Diane, you may begin.
Great. Good morning. Welcome to the session on duplication of benefits in the CDBG-CV program. I'm glad you're here. I'm Diane Schmutzler. I'm a senior CPD specialist. I've been working in the Office of Community Planning and Development in various capacities for the past 15 years, and I'm excited to be talking with you today. I hope you've been finding the conference really helpful. Oh, next slide, by the way. Thank you. Oh, go back one. Apparently there's one missing. Anyway, so we'll cover the introduction. So anyway, I hope you've been finding the conference helpful and that this session is going to be no different than that. For our duplication of benefits this morning, before I jump into housekeeping, go ahead. You can go ahead to the housekeeping slide. That's fine. But for our duplication of benefits this morning, we're going to cover a basic overview of the rules around duplication of benefits. We'll walk through a simple sample calculation, and then we're going to cover what you can do with your policies and procedures to put you in the best position to prevent duplication of benefits in your CDBG-CV program. And also, hopefully, reduce any stress or intimidation you may experience in the process. I know mentioning duplication of benefits can also often sound a little bit scary and concerning. Hopefully today will help ease some of those worries because that's the goal of this presentation. It's more than just teaching you about what duplication of benefits are and what it means for the CDBG-CV program. We really want you to leave after this and feel more confident and comfortable in knowing what you need to do and what you can do to prevent any duplication of benefits in your program. And also just realize you don't have to be intimidated by the idea. So first, now we'll go to the housekeeping items. So we'll start. You've probably been through this before. I'm sure many of you, not all of you, have been on these conference sessions throughout this week. But since this is the first session of the 5th day, happy Friday, I'm confident, I'm still confident most of you know what's going on here. So the PowerPoint slides for this presentation should be available at the bottom of your screen amongst that list of many documents there. So if you want to follow along, you can pull those up. There's also a few supplemental documents that I'll be referencing that should be in that list. And in any case, the PowerPoint slides will be available after the presentation if needed. So next slide, please. Your questions, we will answer content-related questions verbally, not in writing, and we'll be doing that throughout the presentation, but feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentations whenever they come up, and I'll do my best to answer them either then or at the end. Next slide, please. There's a chat feature on the slide, and you're welcome to say hello or talk with other participants, and definitely use the chat feature for technical questions. I will not be monitoring the chat, so if you do have questions, please use the Q&A feature for that. Next slide. We are going to have some poll questions in this presentation. You can see them down below at the bottom of the lower down in your screen, and I'm going to try to share the results, but I'll at least mention and give you a verbal explanation of the results. Next slide, please. We are also, this one got left off, we are also using Slido, I believe, if you want to be using that to keep track of the presentation, of the questions for entering your questions and for answering the poll questions. All right. So this is actually where I have poll question number 1, just to get a sense of what your experience is with duplication of benefits. So there we go. Thank you. So we're basically looking to see which kind of category you fit in. Are you pretty confident in your knowledge of DOB? Or are you familiar with DOB, but you still get nervous about handling and preventing possible DOBs? Or maybe you've never even managed DOB, but you know you need to, and you're still a little bit worried about that. Or perhaps this is your first time ever even hearing about duplication of benefits, and you're not even sure where to start. So any of those are fine. Just please select the category that most closely fits your level of experience, and we're going to go from there. Oh, this is great. So a lot of it looks like no one in here quite has actually had experience with DOB yet. So that's great. So this presentation should work really well for you then, because we're going to really walk through the history of DOB, what it is, and what you need to do for your policies and procedures. So thank you for participating. Yeah, it looks like I don't have anybody who's actually looked at DOB before in practice. All right. So welcome. You're in the right place. Next slide, please. All right, so duplication of benefits. If you have participated in these sessions throughout this week, I'm sure you have heard about duplication of benefits. It comes up very frequently, and it often feels like it's carrying some weight to it, and like it might be something challenging, but it's a pretty simple concept. So we're here to walk you through that and dive deep into that so you can really grasp the important pervasive topic and leave here more comfortable with your ability to recognize and manage possible duplication of benefits for your CDBG-CV program. So what is duplication of benefits? What do we mean when we say DOB? Quite simply, a duplication of benefits occurs when a person, household, business, government, or other entity receives financial assistance from multiple sources for the same purpose or cost. And the total assistance that they've received for that purpose is more than the total need for assistance. So to put it a little bit more simply, a DOB occurs when there's assistance from multiple sources for the same activity, and then that total assistance is greater than the need for the type of assistance. So what we are doing, and when we're talking about DOB, is we're talking about how to prevent duplication of benefits. We don't want more than, you can have more than one funding sources going towards the same activity, but we don't want to have more funds going to that activity than what there is a need for, okay? So the amount of DOB is the amount of assistance in excess of the need. Individuals, businesses, governments, and other entities are all subject to DOB requirements. And it's really that simple. It really is. It's that simple, that straightforward. More funding than what is actually there for the need is a duplication of benefit. So it's your job to address the questions of whether there is more funding for an activity than what's needed, determine what to do about that if that happens, and most importantly, prevent it by setting up your program in a way to help prevent that from occurring. Next slide, please. So in knowing actually, these are the wrong slides. Is there a technical way of fixing that one?
What would you like to do?
Can I shift to sharing my own screen?
Yes.
And you did a separate presentation on DOB?
I'm not sure how this one made it through. This is an older version.
Well, this is from the regular PowerPoint.
I understand. It must, perhaps I maybe shared the wrong deck.
Which is fine. So you can share you have screen sharing capability. So just
Okay.
go ahead and share your slide.
Great. I just got to figure out how to do that without, one moment. Sorry about that. Actually, I'm just going to cancel that to open the right version. So. This means the other track will also have the wrong set of slides.
This is admin to Diane. I also just sent you my email via our internal chat. If you want to email me the slides, I'll try to get them real quick that way too.
Great. Okay. All right, so I'm going to close that one. All right, so you've got copy. PowerPoint's always very slow. Okay. And then okay, let's see. I've got mine pulled up.
Great. So if you go to presentation mode,
Right.
down at the bottom, there should be a icon that looks kind of like a podium.
I got
We
to.
use that.
Or go to slideshow.
Well, I don't want it to take over my whole screen.
Oh,
Yeah. That's the challenge. Worst comes to worst, we can just make it take over this screen. Will that work for now?
It could, and one suggestion, if you do go to slideshow, I would have you check one setting that might allow you to treat it as a single window.
Okay.
So under setup slideshow,
Yep.
one more to the left, if you, yes, thank you. And if you, on the upper left, you could try browse by an individual window
Okay.
and select that bullet. And then when you go to share, you may be able to pick that where it broadcasts that through the share, and you're still able to see other things.
Yep, there we go. That works. Okay, so can you see a slide that says what is not DOB?
Yes, we
Yes, we
do.
can.
Great. Exactly where it should be. Thank you for your help in working on that technical difficulty. Hopefully, I just sent it to the other track as well. So hopefully they have, they're able to resolve that as well. Okay. So we've got through that. I'm getting back to my place. Here we go. Joining back in. So now I'm very glad, Gloria, especially glad that you're here with me to help with the question and answers because I have way too many windows open right now. So thank you all for your patience and thank you for your assistance in that. And sorry about that error. So here we go. So what is not a DOB? That's what we're talking about. We just talked about what is a DOB, what duplications include, and now we're going to look at the other side of things to get that full picture. It's also because that's also helpful. There is no duplication of benefits when the CDBG-CV funds are used for a different purpose than the other available funding. I do still have a landline, and that's what you're hearing right now. It's an antiquated version, but it serves a purpose. So it's also not a DOB when they're used for the same purpose, but for a different allowable use than other available funding. There's no DOB if the funds are not available to the applicant, and there's no DOB if the funds are from a private loan. And finally, there's no DOB if the funds are from an asset or a line of credit. So let's talk about cash for a second. In general, cash is considered an asset or a line of credit, so there's no DOB. And if there's no specific purpose assigned to the cash, then it's also still not a DOB. And a beneficiary's income, for that matter, is not going to be considered a duplication of benefits. The basic rule here is to look at this from a prudent person perspective based on the cost principles. And we're going to talk about that as we move through the presentation. But just want to give you a quick example, and we'll talk about a similar example later. Let's say a person who lost their job due to COVID receives a gift of $100 from their church, and that $100 has absolutely no assigned purpose or requirement for its use. So in that case, even though they're receiving funding from another source, it has no assigned purpose. It could be for COVID. They could use it for anything. It's a gift. It wouldn't be a DOB with CDBG-CV funding because it's cash and it has that no purpose, no assigned purpose to it. But we're going to use another similar example later that'll show the difference. Let's see. So let's do poll question number 2 here. So which of the following is the duplication of benefits? And I believe you should be able to do this then on the Slido, right? Yep. So this is available on the Slido. And let's see. The question A, CDBG-CV funds are used for a different purpose than another source. The CDBG-CV funds are used for the same purpose, but a different allowable use, such as rent for different months. Would it be the total funds from all sources, including CDBG-CV, is greater than the applicant's need? Or a private loan is used for the same purpose as the CDBG-CV funds? Or an asset or line of credit? Yep. It is available for the same purpose as CDBG-CV funds. So see, what are our results looking like? Looking pretty good. From what I can see is that everybody's selecting, you've got a couple going in the wrong answer. So the correct answer here is answer C. It is the only duplication of benefits in this list is that the total funds from all sources, including CDBG-CV, is greater than the applicant's need. That's the duplication of benefits. Some folks selected A. So A reads CDBG funds are used for a different purpose than another source. That's not going to be a duplication of benefits because it's funding being used on different purposes for different activities. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. And if it's not, then by the end of the presentation, I hope it will be. So next slide. I don't need to say that anymore because I'm in control. Lovely. So we've covered what duplication of benefit means, but where do these requirements come from? Here on the slide, you can see the list of background source materials for DOB requirements, and these are the resources that you can lean on. We have the Stafford Act, the CDBG-CV CARES Act requirements, CDBG-CV grant agreement with HUD, and OMB cost principles. Now, I want to point out that, shifting this a little bit, I want to point out that while I've included CDBG-DR Federal Register's notice on this slide, which CDBG-DR, if you're not familiar, is CDBG for disaster recovery. The DR stands for disaster recovery. These register notices, CDBG-DR register notice, only apply to disaster recovery. They don't apply to CDBG-CV. However, I'm including them because it's helpful for you to be aware of them, and they provide general directions and materials for duplication of benefit practices. And a lot of times grantees have had experience with CDBG-DR, and you're familiar with those DR notices already. And it's just want to make sure you know that they don't govern CDBG-CV directly. Because there is some overlap, you can still learn from them, but we're not going to review any of the DR references today. So just a moment. Again. All right, so the Stafford Act, let's dive into some of these background requirements. This was amended in 2019. We're going to talk about that at the end of the session. Pretty much the amendment just addressed how loans were treated in the Stafford Act for DOB. I have the link on here for the Stafford Act. You are free to take a look and read it yourself. It's also attached at the bottom of the presentation and the list of documents. It's actually quite short, so I found it helpful to read it. You don't need to. But it takes a little bit of the intimidation factor away. At least I thought so, because it is so short. So pretty simple and basic. So the Stafford Act states that it requires federal agencies assure that no person, business, concern, or other entity will receive such assistance with respect to any part of such loss as to which he has received financial assistance under any other program or from insurance or any other source. So that's a mouthful right there. But that's basically the short and quick version of that is you can't have more funding provided for an activity than what the need is. Now, the federal government passes this directive on to its grantees. So what's also included is a DOB liability provision. And this provision, and what's important about this, I'm not going to read it off to you, is that it makes the individual liable for duplication of benefits. So HUD doesn't normally use this method of enforcement against the grantee, but it's important for you to know that that provision is in there and that there's some possibility that it could be used in particular by other agencies. So I want you to be aware of it. But the bottom line here that you need to take away is that the grantee is solely responsible for ensuring that actual duplication of benefits does not occur. All right. So now let's look at the CDBG-CV provision in the CARES Act that establishes the requirement to prevent DOB. Here it states that for CDBG-CV grants, the CARES Act provides that the Secretary shall ensure there are adequate procedures in place to prevent any duplication of benefits as required by Section 312 of the Stafford Disaster and Relief Assistance Act as amended, which is what I just read to you, or one section of it that I read to you. There's only a few more statements in there. Like I said, it's very, very short. So clearly stated, you have to, for CDBG-CV, prevent a duplication of benefits. Now, the resources available for you to help better understand this outside of this presentation and after this for you to study up on, I've got all the links here for you that can help you with this. CDBG-CV guidance is posted at the first one. The second one includes our CDBG-CV TA products on DOB. There's a list of them, quite a number of webinars and other sessions and other resources. Specifically what is there, and that's the third link here, is the CDBG-CV DOB Quick Guide. So you can find that at that link anytime. I've also included that at the bottom of this section for your reference. And finally, the fourth link on here is for the CPD Notice 1706. This is a general reference that was published in 2017, so that predates CDBG-CV, but it explains, and it's not specific to DR, even though it talks about disaster recovery, but it explains how duplication of benefits applies to all of CBD programs when that grantee is carrying out CDBG-DR funding that's specific to a disaster. But in there, I've included just as a resource, as a reference, because it provides a nice overview of how all these programs, how all this comes together and what your responsibilities are, and how that applies to other CPD programs. So, and wait, I'm talking about CDBG-DR, and I've talked and I said that they don't apply to CDBG-CV. And I want to point out one more thing, or what specifically doesn't apply. So it's true, you don't want to use CDBG-DR notices in place of CV policy guidance. But again, CDBG-DR guidance and notices can be helpful for general understanding of DOB and specifically for guidance on policies and procedures. The main thing you need to know about what makes a difference is that CDBG-DR has a statutory order of assistance that's unique to CDBG-DR. And those provisions often indicate that you have to use FEMA or SBA or Army Corps of Engineer fundings first before you can use HUD funding. There's no order of assistance for CV. So that's the most important thing to remember, is that CDBG-CV grantees do not need to follow a statutory order of assistance for delivery like CDBG-DR does. And that's why you really need to be sure you understand that. So if you do look at DR, you're recognize that you don't need to worry about that. So you don't need to validate other funding sources are available before allocating CDBG-CV assistance. And that's pretty much the main element there. So at the end of the day, the main process for preventing duplication of benefits in CDBG-DR and CDBG-CV are the same. It's just DR is more complicated. All right, so now we're going to go to our third poll question. And this says it's a true or false. CDBG-CV, have that up. There we go. CDBG-CV does not require an order of assistance. In other words, you do not have to access all other available assistance prior to receiving CDBG-DV funds. So let's see. We get some more answers in. So far, it's looking like everybody is saying it's true, and that's correct. That's true. It does not require an order of assistance. Oh, we have a couple who are saying it's false. So again, CDBG-CV does not require that order of assistance. You do not, so this is a true statement. You do not have to access all other available assistance prior to receiving CDBG-CV funds. Okay, that's how it's different from the disaster recovery grants. All right, so next, we're going to talk about OMB cost principles and how they reinforce DOB grant requirements. The requirements to prevent DOB are incorporated into your CDBG-CV grant agreement with HUD, and that can be enforced with remedies and sanctions if needed. But since grantees are solely responsible for ensuring that an actual duplication of benefits does not occur, it's important that you include DOB requirements in your agreements with subrecipients and beneficiaries. So in addition, the grant agreements that you have make the OMB cost principles applicable for all grants. And I've included the list of relevant regulations on the slide that make the cost principles regulations at 2 CFR 200 subpart E applicable to the largest of CPD's programs so that you can use those for reference. The cost principles here are another great tool to help you with preventing duplication of benefits and to reinforce your DOB grant requirements. And I'm going to explain how that works. So OMB cost principles on this slide, these provide you with a practical means for determining if a cost is allowable, reasonable, or allocable. The Stafford Act states that a cost allocated to the grant must be necessary and reasonable for the performance of the federal award. So let me take you back to the definition of DOB again. So a DOB means receiving financial assistance from multiple sources for the same purpose, and the total assistance received for that purpose is more than the total need of assistance. Fundamentally, a duplication of benefits is not reasonable. It's not allocable and it's not allowable. So the fundamental principle by itself is not reasonable, allocable, or allowable. So what do those three terms really mean? And how do you apply them in real life? So the regulatory citations are provided on the slide for your reference, but let's talk about how these concepts work and how you can use them every day. So when applying OMB cost principles, you're going to want to ask some basic questions. Is it necessary? Is the cost for an eligible activity? Does it meet program standards? Is there a need for the assistance? Then you're going to ask about reasonableness. Is it reasonable? Would a prudent person consider the cost to be payable by the award? Does it fall under one of the other reasonableness factors listed at 2 CFR 200-404? And then you're going to look at, is it allocable? Are the costs in accordance with relative benefits received? So these are the questions you can ask when you're looking and trying to apply the cost principles and looking at DOB. So for any program, grantees can assess the risk for duplication of benefits and determine the net level of necessary oversight or review based on that risk. So that's an important concept, and we're going to come back to that again. So cost principles guard against DOB. Let's look at an example. Think about with rental assistance. Your typical procedures, how typical procedures can promote necessary and reasonable costs and guard against DOB. So consider rental assistance. Rental assistance funds can come from many sources. So you're going to need to be on the lookout for duplication of benefits. So start by asking yourself, how will you assess the amount needed for rent, utility costs, and deposits? What sources are available to pay the costs? Are your procedures even designed to assess funding sources that typical beneficiaries could possibly receive for the same purpose? If beneficiaries receive assistance from several sources, are those funding sources for the same costs or different costs that are part of the same activity? Finally, now that you have all that information, are those costs reasonable based on the type of assistance and income of the beneficiary? Now, I do want to make a note about income for the beneficiary. While the beneficiary's income is not a source of assistance for purposes of calculating DOB, income generally must inform the assessment of how much assistance is reasonable under cost principles. So basically, while the cost principles protect against DOB, and DOB and cost principles are not the same thing. They reinforce each other and they're tools working for the same purpose, but DOB is specific to the person, but necessary and reasonable questions can happen at a program level. So for example, if there's already money from another source to pay for something, you wouldn't pay for it with CDBG-CV. At the same time, necessary and reasonable goes beyond DOB consideration. All right. So let's do poll question number 4. Another true or false. In order to meet, I'm going to pull mine up on Slido over here. There we go. In order to meet all federal requirements, all CDBG-CV expenses must be necessary, reasonable, and allocable. Is that true or false? Let's see those responses coming in. What do you think? Still seeing mostly everyone's answering true, so good. That's good. Great. Oh, yeah, a couple are false. So again, back and repeat. This is a true statement. In order to meet all federal requirements, all CDBG-CV expenses must be necessary, reasonable, and allocable. All right, so basic DOB calculations. We're going to shift gears a little bit and do some math. Great way to start a Friday morning, but this stuff is pretty simple. And I like math anyway. So we're going to start. Simple example. All right, for establishing a DOB strategy and guidelines, grantees and subrecipients should become familiar with the basic steps of performing a DOB analysis. These steps provide the foundation for your operating procedures for preventing duplication of benefits. The first step you're going to need to do is straightforward. Assess the amount of need or the total cost of the activity. So we're going to use this example of a $100,000 cost to rehab a long-term care facility for renovating a floor so it can be used for isolation to care for COVID-19 patients. Then we're going to do step 2. And it's important to determine the amount of assistance. Now, it's important to remember that when evaluating a recipient's needs, that a recipient may have multiple sources of assistance to address those needs. Not all sources may be used for the same cost. So be sure to ask about the recipient's resources and how they plan to apply those resources to specific costs. So in this case, we were looking at the renovation of a single floor for isolation purposes. And you want to make sure that the funding sources, the other funding sources are going to that same purpose. You may find that resources will be applied to separate costs and not present a duplication of benefits. So if it's used for a different purpose, even if it's the same facility, there may not be a duplication of benefits in that case because it's a different purpose. So in the case of our example, we had $100,000 for COVID-19 funds available. And in this case, we have the long-term care facility was awarded a $50,000 grant from HHS Skilled Nursing Relief Fund to prepare for, and respond to coronavirus, and has $10,000 of that amount remaining after paying for the other HHS eligible costs. So they can use that $10,000 for that same renovation. So in this case, cost for activity is $100,000. Other sources, we have $10,000 from HHS fund. You subtract that out to find the difference. So our maximum CDBG award possible would be $90,000. That's considered the unmet need. That maximum award is unmet need. When there's a balance of unsupported costs after applying existing resources, then the CARES Act can be invested without causing a duplication of benefits. The last step of this process is to document steps 1 to 3. If you've incorporated elements of the prevention of DOB in your policies and procedures, then this step should run really smoothly. So remember, duplication of benefits and cost principles are closely related. When you document the cost charged to your CARES Act, according to the standards for financial management at 2 CFR Part 200, you can also use that documentation to document your compliance with DOB. So the idea is you bake it all in. And we're going to talk about that in more detail when we dive into our principles, our policies, and procedures rather. So here's one more example. We have a family seeks emergency rental assistance under an ESG funded homelessness prevention program that provides assistance for up to 6 months. So remember our 4 steps: assess the need, determine other sources that have been or will be used to pay part or all of the cost, calculate the maximum award or the unmet need, and document that analysis for compliance. So we're assessing the need. In this case, we're saying its monthly rent is $800. The monthly utilities, we're going to estimate, just make an estimation here, combining all those utilities together is $200. So the total need for a monthly basis for this family is $1,000, and that's for 6 months that they need. So that's the need, step 1. Step 2 is determine the assistance from other sources for the same cost. In this case, the application asks whether the family is receiving assistance from another source. The family reports that its church, remember we had that church example before about giving them a gift of $100 for no clear purpose? This one's a little more specific this time. So the family reports that its church has pledged to pay its utility bills, which is a specific purpose, in arrears, and do that for the next 3 months. The family certifies it has not applied for assistance from any other source. So the duplicative amount for the same purpose from other sources are the utility payments for 3 months, which are then estimated to be $600, okay? What I want to note too is that phrase, the family certified it has not applied for assistance from other sources. It's important to know that those other sources may be available to recipients, so you should include in your subrogation agreement, and we're going to talk about that, include in your subrogation agreement a requirement for the beneficiary subrecipient to notify you as the provider of those funds if additional resources become available, and that agreement should also be set up in a way that enables you to recapture those funds or to have them pay them back to you if they're no longer needed by the recipients once other resources do become available. All right, so that side note, important. We're estimating our amount. Utility payments for estimated to be $600. So we're going to calculate the maximum monthly award to avoid DOB. So we have months 1 to 3, 1,000 minus 200, it's $800. And that's accounting for that gift, for that total $600 gift, which we're breaking back up into $200 per month, okay, because they're only covering 3 months. So you calculate months 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, and 3 with that award incorporated into that. So their total monthly need is $1,000. For the first 3 months, subtract that $200 per month. So that comes out to be $800 a month just for those first 3 months. Then so that's your remaining net need. For months 4 and 6, 4, 5, and 6, there is no additional funding source from another location. So in those cases, that full need of $1,000 is what that applicant is going to need. So in this case, you would have months 1, 2, and 3. Each month, you would be able to pay $800 without a duplication of benefits. For months 4, 5, and 6, you'd be able to cover with CDBG-CV funds $1,000 per month without a duplication of benefits. Okay. So those were our simple math examples. Now we're going to go right into policies and procedures and how to set this up. This process is actually really straightforward, but the challenge is the biggest challenge you're going to have in this whole experience with DOB and preventing DOB is obtaining that information you need to make the calculations and then documenting it. So you really need to make sure you have solid policies and procedures in place to document that you've adequately assessed, accounted for, and responded to any possible duplication of benefits. All right, so let's get started. So to get started, keep in mind that for CDBG-CV, some practical pieces are that CDBG-CV duplication of benefits requirements apply to all CDBG-CV allocations, as well as to the fiscal year 2019 and fiscal year 2020 formula CDBG allocations that were used to prepare for, and respond to coronavirus. So those are just those funds from those 2 annual grants that are going for coronavirus pandemic related purposes. Okay, so at least that's our CDBG-CV duplication of benefits. That's what that applies to. The DOB requirements are the same for states and entitlements. A grantee can reassess that need, whatever that need for the beneficiary is at a later point in time. So we just talked about the example where they said they hadn't applied for additional funding, perhaps they had, and then you would have to reassess to see if they actually received the funding they applied for. And then, so there could also be rent increases or increases in construction costs or other orders. Then we're looking at uniformity in process. This is just some solid guidelines for developing your policies and procedures to keep in mind as you do this. Uniformity in process can support your consistent outcomes. This one's really important. Here is where you want to bake all of your DOB elements into the process steps, wherever it's relevant. So you want to ensure that you have uniformity in how you do things at the program and activity level. So for example, if you're doing a budget, then you want to have all those sources identified. If you're using an intake form for beneficiaries, you want to ask them for their other sources of funding on that form. So that way you're not just treating everybody the same, but you're also gathering that same information at the same time. You're doing yourself a big favor by putting it out there right away and being able to gather that information. So let's think about that, talk about that one a little bit more. Asking about DOB in the application intake process. You can ask, have you received rental assistance from other community organizations in the last 3 months? What resources have you used to pay rent or utilities in the last 3 months? So these are some things you can put into your standard protocols to start gathering that information you need to calculate and establish if there's a duplication of benefits. Document the questions and resources provided by the client. Some other ideas here: confirm or request verification from organizations on amounts and time periods. Have the client sign a statement affirming that they have not received financial assistance for the same period of time from another organization. You can have the client sign a statement that they acknowledge and agree to repay funds if in the event that a duplication of benefits is determined, and have that be a condition of receiving assistance. And you can also include risk-based analysis in your procedures, like service providers who are providing the same target population or service providers that received CARES funding from similar activities. All right. So the DOB analysis, remember, is at the level of the activity of beneficiary, not at the program level. So the grantee or subrecipient is like a person who could have a DOB. Finally, in this case, duplication of benefit requirements must be passed down to all subrecipients. And one more thing to keep in mind is a program office may provide more specific information to comply with the program requirements. So that's like our DOB, the CDBG-DR program has more specific requirements than we do. So a quick, so grantees and subrecipients are also subject to duplication of benefits. And I have a brief example here where CDBG-CV funds were supporting the salary of a social service provider who works for a Meals on Wheels program. And the program also receives funding from the HHS Meals for Older Adults program. The grantee can require detailed budget to distinguish which costs are supported by which program to establish if there's a duplication of benefits there. Additional considerations about risk when you're building your policies and procedures. You should consider designing duplication of benefit policies and procedures that are specific to each CDBG-CV program and activity. That could really help you out. Grantees must make reasonable assumptions about risk and necessary documentation. Your policies and procedures for assessing duplication of benefits should be commensurate with the risk of duplication of benefits. For example, if a future assistance is nearly certain but amount is uncertain, then you can assume there may be a higher risk for duplication of benefits because you know there might be more funding coming in. We just don't have that conclusion or confirmation just yet. Your policies and procedures for duplication of benefits should be specific to each CDBG-CV program or activity. Risk assumptions, extent of effort to document absence of DOB should be defensively reasonable. The risk of DOB may inform policy regarding monitoring subrecipients or beneficiaries for DOB after assistance is provided. And now, what actually needs to be in your policies and procedures? And how should you actually implement this with your subrecipients or beneficiaries? So to comply with DOB requirements, grantees are required by the CARES Act to establish and are required to establish and follow procedures to ensure that a DOB does not occur. Establishing a process to effectively identify and prevent duplication of benefits is critical for CDBG-CV grantees to effectively manage the multiple active funds related to coronavirus response and effectively targeting CDBG-CV resources to meet unmet needs within the community. So you should establish policies and procedures that incorporate the following components. You want to make sure you have a subrogation agreement. I already mentioned that once, but have a subrogation agreements with requirement to repay that assistance that's determined to be duplicative if that were to occur. So in doing this, it establishes a protocol to monitor compliance based on the risk of DOB as well. Okay, so that's really important. That's what can tie your beneficiaries and make sure that you can get repaid if there's a duplication of benefits. So that you don't actually have to repay your federal grant from other funds. You want to include in your policies and procedure a method of assessing the likelihood of a duplication of benefits by evaluating the need and the resources available. So I have a link here. We have put together, it's about a little more than a year old, but we've put together a list of Federal CARES Act and coronavirus response programs and funding sources within the federal government. So you can take a look at that if you're not familiar with some of the other agencies and the funding that they're providing for to address the COVID-19 pandemic. That list will give you some ideas of what you can look at, look for, what you can ask about for some of your bigger projects and activities. And that list, I believe, is also included in the documents attached to this presentation. Now, to ensure policies and procedures accurately reflect the specific components of each program, grantees should consider designing their duplication of benefits policies and procedures that are specific to each CDBG-CV program, supported with CARES Act funding, and commensurate with the risk of duplication of benefits. So I want to give you an example. You have, or conceptual example. You have an involved or complex program like rental assistance, then the policies and procedures might be more detailed, because in those cases, you have a higher risk of DOB. Remember, we used that example earlier. Rental assistance can come from a lot of funding sources. So you have a higher risk that there's going to be a duplication of benefits. If you have a low risk of DOB for something that's a type of activity that's a lot more straightforward and simple and isn't as likely to have funding sources coming from many different areas, your policies and procedures may be more simple for that. And so finally, applicants should consider, under the risk of penalty, that they understand that they can't have duplication of benefits. All right, so we're getting close. The other part here is you want to look for other funding sources. This can be one of the most challenging parts. We just talked about that with that list, referencing that list of other Federal CARES Act funding that you can look at. You want to be proactive and engage with your beneficiaries and subrecipients to gather this information for possible sources. And talking with folks over this week and just in knowing about duplication of benefits, I understand this can be one of the most challenging parts, is identifying where these other funding sources are coming from and figuring out how to do that. You have to be proactive in doing it. One of the ways you can do it, in our policies and procedures, including your intake forms, we talked about that. You can also use data sharing agreements. Be a little bit more engaged with this. Use data sharing agreements and compare beneficiary lists with other programs that are operating and funding similar activities for similar purposes. You can compare with other programs just within your own agency. And you can also ask applicants for other funds or sources they've received. And we talked about that with the intake form. The overarching principle here is that when you're developing your policies and procedures, HUD standard is that they have to be adequate. The grantee should say, what is adequate, and they need to write it down. And that way, when HUD monitors, you can point out in that document how you establish your policies and procedures to be accurate and complete. And that if you've made that determination, then HUD will be able to clearly at least walk through and see the process that you went through to say, this is how we determined that we didn't have a duplication of benefits and how our policies and procedures were adequate enough to ensure that. We've checked these sources, we've done all these things, and you've written that down, and you can clearly share that with us. And finally, here you can strategize. So when you know one or more sources could be used to pay for an activity, then perhaps you can eliminate potential sources of duplication by eliminating the overlap in planned uses of funds. So you can be creative about that. So if a duplication of benefit is found, what happens? You can always reevaluate the need and document the remaining duplication of benefit. But typically, there's going to be more need than there's money available. And that makes sense to see if the need has increased, or to see if the need has increased, because usually that's the case, is there's more need than funding available. Now, if your reevaluation still shows a duplication of benefits, then you can write a letter to the beneficiary requesting repayment or other collection procedures. And if you have a subrogation agreement in place, then you have a contractual basis to get that money back. Any collected amounts from those beneficiaries to the grantee. So if they had more funding available, you find out and you say, oh, you got a duplication of benefits, you're going to have to repay that $100. Then they pay that $100 back to you appropriately. And that is going to be treated like a return of grant funds or an applicable credit. It's not considered program income. Program income is another item, another subject that can give people heartburn and make people feel very intimidated, just like duplication of benefits does. So please take note of that, that right there. If you do have a duplication of benefits repaid back to you from your beneficiaries, it is treated like a grant funds or applicable credit, not program income. Okay, it's like a rebate. It's coming back to you. Now, if your grantee doesn't, your beneficiaries don't pay that back, and HUD finds that you have a duplication of benefits, there could be a recapture in that case. And in that case, the grantee is responsible for compliance with grant requirements, and non-compliance would be subject to program remedy. So if the grantee, this is why it's so important that you have that subrogation agreement in place with your beneficiaries, because if you don't have a way for that grantee to repay, then you are going to be on the hook to HUD for non-compliance. Okay, so ultimately, the responsibility falls on the grantee. If you collect DOB from your subrecipients, then there's nothing for HUD that HUD would need to reinforce, because the funds have come back to the purpose intended and not a DOB. Okay, so I'm going to try to speed up here. Our best practices include questions in the application to assess whether other sources are available to pay for the same costs. Ask to verify likely sources of assistance that might be available to pay for the same costs. Include an agreement to repay DOB as a condition of assistance. Develop risk-based DOB procedures and policies. And then finally, adopt policies and procedures to address how the grantee plans to recover duplicative assistance when a DOB is identified so it can avoid noncompliance. I'm going to skip this poll question just because we're running a little bit late here. And we're going to go straight to our special considerations. Okay. So this one we'll actually move fairly quickly because this is really just giving you that update on the Stafford Act and what changed here. So the Stafford Act was amended by FEMA publishing guidance in February 2019 that basically said that loans are not considered a DOB for years covered by DRRA. So the DRRA is an act that was passed. So what you need to know here is that, popped it back, wrong area. What you need to know here is that this doesn't automatically require the use of federal grant funds to repay loans, depending on the grant program requirements. But what is important to you is that loans are considered differently than permanent assistance when establishing a duplication of benefits. The terms of the loan and the source of the loan are consideration. And generally, a loan, like a subsidized loan, is not a prohibited duplication of benefits, so long as it's used towards the activity. Now, I have on here the link for the FEMA fact sheet for DRAA. This covers the federal disasters that were declared between 2016 and 2021, which includes the coronavirus pandemic. This sunsets in October of 2023, but you probably won't really need to worry about that. But what it does is it changed the effect or changed what loans were to be included in a DOB analysis. That's what you need to know. What loans are included in DOB analysis? So here you can see private loans are never considered a DOB. These are loans that are not provided by a guaranteed or government entity. Subsidized loans, they might be a DOB. It depends. It depends if they're forgivable or where they're coming from. So you'll have to look at that. Declined loans are never DOB. If a person for a beneficiary never signed loan documents, it doesn't exist, it's declined, it's not going to be considered a DOB, and canceled loans are never a DOB as well. Some special notes on DOB here for this is that the short-term loans like construction loans must be repaid, may not be a DOB, and this will still continue to apply so long as if DRA sunsets in 2023. The Stafford Act allows federal funds to be used for short-term coverage when primary sources will be available later, subject to agreement to repay. And then I also want you to pay close attention to the eligibility for reimbursement with loans. So these are the main loan ones. Additional special treatment on loans to pull this together. Actually, this is just our example, and I want to take a look. I'm going to hold off on that for a second, see if there's any questions. Not actually seeing any. All right, so we got 3 minutes. I'm going to go through this example very quickly. So loans are treated differently, and that's how the Stafford Act was amended so that they aren't actually under, it depends on the type of loan to determine whether or not they're DOB. So you can look at those slides and pull that together. And I'm pushing through the end here. So in this case, the example is Shelley Shoemaker. It has a repair shop. It's a for-profit business. It was shut down because of the COVID-19 emergency declaration. Sally's business applied for and received an SBA Paycheck Protection Program loan, and that helped keep staff employed during the crisis. This loan is going to be fully forgiven if the funds are used for payroll costs, interest on mortgage, rent, and utilities. At least 60% of the forgiven amount must also have been used for payroll. And how can CDBG grant you as a CDBG-CB grantee assist Sally without a DOB? So there's no duplication of benefits if the CDBG grantee provides assistance for the cost of CDBG eligible activities that are not one of the eligible uses of PPP loans. So if you're providing assistance that is for payroll, employee health insurance, mortgage insurance, rent, utilities, other things like that, then and your CDBG CV is providing assistance for something else, it wouldn't a different purpose, then that wouldn't be a duplication of benefits. Sally, there's also no DOB if Sally Shoemaker has not received financial assistance for that cost for some other source. There's no DOB if the need remains. So in other words, Sally Shoemaker didn't misuse SBA funds to meet the need, and she still actually has additional need available. So that's one of the ways what you can look at. And finally, if Sally Shoemaker uses the PPP funds for payroll, employee health insurance, mortgage interest, any of these other elements, the CDBG grantee may be able to assist other remaining needs for which Sally has not received any source of assistance, such as perhaps upgrading the shop's HVAC system to reduce the spread of germs, or reconfiguring the building and parking lot to add drive-through window service or for customers to increase social distancing and avoid too much contact. So again, you can look at it, you have to look at the circumstances, but that amendment changed how, oh, there we go. Changed how how we treat loans with considering duplication of benefits. So finally, we have the additional resources. Here's some additional guidance that you can consider. I'm not going to address those right now, but just some additional items you can look at that may be relevant. And I do have one question, although we are at time. It says for 6 months. This is more of a question for I believe, the type of rental assistance. Gloria, do you actually want to take that? Because it seems less of a DOB question.
Sure. I'm presuming you're talking here about emergency grant assistance.
Mm-hmm.
And for the 6 months, and then they decide to request assistance again. What we've determined is that if they've received assistance once with CDBG CV for the entire 6 months, they cannot request assistance again for the same activity. Even though it's in a different location, it doesn't make any difference. The idea is that this family has already been assisted for up to 6 consecutive months as provided for the notice. Therefore, they can, whether they move or stay in the same place, they cannot apply for the same assistance again later. We don't call it a duplication of benefits. We just, but the answer is they cannot.
Great. Thank you very much, Gloria. Thank you so much for Diane. Thank you, Diane, for your on the fly transitioning to your PowerPoint. We are at 10 o'clock a.m. Eastern, and we are transitioning to IDIS online. Take it away, Susan.
Great. Let me stop sharing. There we go.
Okay. Hi, everyone. This is the IDIS online presentation, and I hope everyone sees my screen.
Yep.
And I'm going to introduce Rob. Hi, Rob.
Yeah. Hi. Sorry, I was speaking on mute. It's a little early here out in California, so I'm full of coffee. But here we go. Good morning, everyone. This session of the HUD CARES Act Virtual Training Conference 2022 is about IDIS. So one of HUD's online reporting and disbursement systems, and most importantly, the one used for CDBG and CDBG CV. Next session at 11:15 a.m. Eastern, we'll be discussing financial management. Please plan to stay with us. Sessions will continue throughout the day. Please see the event website. My name is Rob Strauss. I'm with the Cloudburst Group. I'm pleased to be joined today in this track by two of my colleagues, Susan Walsh. Hey, Susan. Hello. And hi. Laura Dietert.
Morning.
You may know them from IDIS Ask a Question. So housekeeping before we start reviewing a few things. This webinar is scheduled for 1 hour. Oh, next slide, please. If anytime you need to step away, please know that the session is being recorded. The slides, transcript, and recording will be all posted on the HUD Exchange, usually within about 2, maybe 3 weeks of the session. You'll also find an instant recording up on the conference site soon after the day ends. All participants today are in listen-only mode and will be for the duration of the session. Note that there is a nifty feature of live captioning. So you'll see the show captions in the website. You can toggle that on and off to show or hide captions. And if you need more information, there is an attendee guide that you should have received. Please consult that. Now about questions. We do have time, we hope, at the end of the presentation, we should, to answer your questions, at least a few of them. Hope to answer as many as we can. Please use the Q&A feature located towards the bottom of the webpage to enter your questions. Please enter them as you have them, and we'll collect them and respond to the end of the session. If we're not able to answer your question today, or sometimes they're a little bit more complicated than can be answered right away, we need some more information, or they're very specific. So please submit those to HUD Exchange Ask a Question for IDIS. Next slide. Yes, thank you. If you're having any technical difficulties with the website, if you need help, hosts from CEDM are available. They'll be keeping an eye on the chat and jump in to help you. You can also send an email to eventsupport@cedmgroup.com. You'll see it on the screen there. Please do not use the chat for questions to the presenters or to myself. We'll be looking at the Q&A only, not the chat. We might drop some things in there every now and then, but if you have a question for the presenters, please use the Q&A. That allows us to manage questions. And finally, next slide, if you do want to view and participate in the Q&A in a separate window, separate browser window, or on a mobile device, navigate on over to sly.do in a new browser window, or install the Slido app on your device. And for this session, you'll see the code there is 720-836. You'll find that down below in the session description. So if you want to use Slido, please feel free to do so and use the code 720-836. And at this point, I'm handing it off to Susan. Hey, Susan.
Hey, thanks, Rob. So we're going to go into some information about the IDIS system. Now, this presentation is not focused so much on the screens in IDIS. It's more about just how to use the system, what is the system, what it reports to HUD, and things like that. We are also going to just barely touch upon CV, but we did have a session on Tuesday that talked about the CDBG CV program in IDIS. And so we recommend that you consult that for further information about the CV. So what is IDIS? Well, first of all, if you don't know what it stands for, it means the Integrated Disbursement and Information System. And I know that I usually say IDIS, some people say IDIS, and I'm not sure if people use another term, but it's our beloved system from HUD to manage all of the CPD formula grant programs, CDBG, HOME, ESG, and HAPWA. It's also used for the Section 108 Loan Guarantee Program. This has been the case for several years now, that all Section 108 loans that are used for activities will then be put into IDIS. You also put in information about your loan and your repayments of your loan. The purpose of IDIS is to draw down and account for the use of funds. And so that's a very important piece of it. And also it's to collect and report information about the funded activities and also the accomplishments that you've made with those activities. So this is just a quick little review of what IDIS is. And this is the bar, just the bar at the top, the menu bar at the top of the system. And listed here on the bullets, it's not actually in the exact order, but the administration tab, which not everyone will see, but you'll only see that if you're an administrator, is where you have user roles and table maintenance. For grantees, it's mostly to assign privileges to staff as needed and activate and inactivate staff. For grantees and participating jurisdictions, there's a tab called grantee/PJ, and that's where you have information about your particular city, county, whatever. And also that's the place where you add carrying out organizations and subordinate organizations. The grant is the information that tells you about the grants that you receive. It also has all of the sub-funds and sub-grant features, which for CDBG, those sub-funds and sub-grants aren't used very much for CDBG, but they can be used as a voluntary thing. So in general, probably most grantees don't use sub-funds and sub-grants so much for CDBG. Then you have your plans, projects, and activities menu, and that's where really between that and the funding drawdown is where most of your information is held and where you mostly will be using the system. The plans, projects, activities is where you do your action plan and consolidated plan. The projects are part of that and are the holders for the activities. And then the activities are where most of the information is stored. You have your funding drawdown. That's where you do your create your vouchers for your drawdowns. That's where you receive program income if you have any of that. And that's where you can search through to find information about past draws and receipts. And then finally, you have reports, which is a feature that ties into MicroStrategy and takes the data from IDIS and creates reports. And that information that you gather for the reports are always from the day before. So reports always lag the actual data in IDIS by 1 day. So this isn't talking so much about the admin feature of IDIS, but just what are the purposes, what is the administration of IDIS used for? And so we have really 3 types of users. And if you're a grantee, you probably don't think about so much the fact that your field office staff and headquarters also use the system. But the grantee, of course, does their action plan, consolidated plans. That's all in the Econ Planning Suite. And then they set up and manage their activities from the projects through their action plan. They commit and draw their funds. They report their accomplishments, and they run reports. Now, field office staff also use IDIS. And first of all, they're going to review and approve your plans that you submit through the Econ Planning Suite. They're also going to be ensuring program compliance, and that's going to be by looking at, they can see your activities, they can see your drawdowns, they can't change that information, but they can see it. And so they can read the narratives that you put in there for your activities and so forth. So they can, by doing that, they can monitor at-risk grantee and activities also through the flagging feature, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and they can generate reports. And finally, headquarters staff also uses IDIS for grant administration. They input the grants into the system and have different features they can use. They also enter or add new users to the system or take out or purge out users that haven't used the system for at least 90 days. So a little reminder to, if you use IDIS, to always make sure you log in at least once every 90 days or you'll be purged from the system. The headquarters staff also uses it to ensure program compliance and monitor program progress, and they also generate reports. So just an overview of the whole grant management process. The first thing is that you develop and you get approval of your 3 to 5 year consolidated plan. And that first year's action plan is a part of your 5-year or 3 to 5 year consolidated plan. And then each year you create your action plan, and that describes all the projects and activities that you'll be doing, and assigns budget amounts, and you talk about how much you're using from that year and how much you may be using of funds from a prior year that carried over. After that's been approved, you'll get your grant agreements, and then you'll have your actual funding for your HUD programs, and you'll see that in IDIS. And then you'll set up your activities under the projects that you set up in your action plan. You'll commit funds for your activities. And then as needed, you will be drawing down those funds from those activities. And finally, you'll be reporting on accomplishments as you go along. When activities are completed, you'll be reporting the final accomplishments, and then each year you'll be using those all those accomplishments and all those narratives and all those reports to put together your CAPR, your Consolidated Annual Performance and Evaluation Report for HUD. So this is just a little summary of the information that you had to do, and I know it says that you will, kind of looks like you will be doing this, but I know that in probably, I mean, maybe every case, this has already been done. But it's a good review because if something wasn't done correctly, you can always go back and fix it. But when grantees were submitting their amendments to include their CDBG-CV funding, they had to mainly go to these sections that are listed here of the action plan. And that would have been, first of all, the AD 25 or AD 26, depending if you were in a consolidated plan or an action plan that wasn't the first year. You would make sure that you had uploaded your executed SF 424 forms, all of your certifications, and also your citizen participation process and any comments that were received. And of course, as a reminder, you were asked to amend that to the existing SF 424 forms and certifications. So you didn't just take away the old information and put in the new, but you actually appended the new information to the old and then uploaded that to the system. The other important part that you had to amend was the AP 15 section of expected resources. And that's where you wanted to add the information under other as CDBG CV to show that you have this new resource now and how much money that was. And most grantees got their funding in two kind of waves. You got your CDBG CV1 and then you got your CDBG CV3. So you had to do one amendment for your first round and then a second amendment for your second round of funds, unless you just were delayed a bit. And in that case, you could have done one amendment for all of the funds. The AP 35 project screen had to be updated so that you could include at least one CV project, and depending on what you were doing with your funds, perhaps several projects. And then for states, this AP 35 screen and the AP 30 method of distribution had to be updated. Now, if you find that you're reading this and you're realizing, wow, you know what, we did something incorrectly, or we didn't put the projects in the right place, or we used the wrong projects, just know that everything can be fixed. And if you realize that you did something wrong, you can always send and ask a question, and we can help you with fixing anything that perhaps wasn't done exactly correctly. So with activity setup, the first thing you do, you should have the projects already in the system from your action plan. And if you don't, it is possible to add projects in IDIS outside of the action plan. But we just want to mention that's perfectly fine to do that. But at some point, you do want to amend your plan to add that project into your action plan so that it's tied together and that your CAPR will generate properly and everything will flow through the projects to your action plan. So when you do add an activity, you're going to, one of the first things you have to decide is what project is that activity going to be under. And so those, you will do a search and you'll find those projects that you want to put your activity under. You can have more than one activity under a project. For example, say you're doing street improvements and you're going to be doing 3 different areas of street improvements, then you could have perhaps 3 different activities, but each one of those activities is going to be a separate, each one of those street improvements is going to be a separate activity, which we're going to go over a little bit later. You want to make sure that you don't just have one activity for 3 different areas of public facilities. But it's certainly okay to group activities under one project if those all address the same goal. So the role of the activity is really where most of the action happens in IDIS. You're going to set up and fund that activity. You're going to put a narrative description. You're going to answer questions as you set that activity up that that addresses types of information that's specific to that activity. You're going to be doing your drawdowns or your vouchers to get your funds, which sends that money to you in a wire. And then you're going to report your accomplishments. And depending on what matrix code, and we're going to show you that in a minute, but depending on what matrix code you select for that activity will, and also the national objective is going to determine what screens are going to be showing and what information you have to answer. And also activities, of course, are where all the accomplishments and performance measures are reported, and where you can also add narratives to really tell your story about what you did with your funds. So IDIS matrix codes are very important because they really describe what you're doing. And as we said before, you know, that really, it depending on the matrix code is going to be what your information you're going to be reporting on. So you need to select the proper matrix code, and you also want to be selecting the most specific matrix code. So if you end up doing an activity and you find out that you had the wrong matrix code, guess what? That can be fixed. And so that's a good thing, but we really don't want to have to try to fix that after the fact. So it's very important to really know when you're setting up your activity, what matrix code is what I need for this specific activity. So there is a matrix code definition chart, and that's available on a HUD Exchange. It's also part of the IDIS manual, CDBG IDIS manual in the appendices. And it goes through, and the appendices go through descriptions of the matrix codes. So you can really look through and see what's the most specific one. Because 03 for public facilities and 05 for public services they both have one called 03Z and 05Z, which is a general category, but HUD really doesn't want you to use that unless there's just no other matrix code that describes what you're doing. So otherwise, you want to use the most specific matrix code that you can. Also, if you're not sure about the matrix code, you definitely want to check with your HUD field office, because really the matrix code and the national objective is how this activity is going to be eligible, right? I mean, the matrix code determines your eligibility, and the national objective is what you have to meet. And so in order for you not to have to return funds, you want to make sure this is going to be eligible from the beginning. So if you're just questioning the matrix code, that might be that maybe you need to talk with your field office a little bit more about what this activity exactly is doing. So here are just some reminders about rules for setting up activities. This isn't necessarily information that you would always see in the IDIS manual, because the IDIS manual is very helpful for the mechanics of going into the system and selecting things, but sometimes it's helpful just to know some of these hints about how to do things properly. And one is that on the address screen, sometimes people don't quite understand what that's for, and they'll put the address of their office. Well, in rare occasions, that is what you're going to put. But for the most part, the address in the activity is going to be the physical address for the activity. So if it's a public facility, it's going to be that particular building or that street. If it's services that are being carried out, then it could be the address of the subrecipient that's carrying out the activities. But that's what they want for the address. For acquisition and disposition, you would set up one activity for each property assisted. You don't want to combine properties in those types of activities. And also for public facilities, you want to set up a separate activity for each public facility. Now, one thing that we see a lot, we don't see so much that if you have several buildings that you're working on, that we don't see, one activity with lots of buildings, and you don't want to do that. You want to have a separate activity for each building. But what we do sometimes see is people setting up, maybe they're doing a street improvement project, and they're going to be working on streets throughout their city or their town. And so they set up one activity for all those streets, and that's not what we want. We want to see a separate activity set up for each street or area. I mean, if you're doing say a few streets all together, like in a cul-de-sac or just all right next to each other, that's one thing. You could do that as one activity. But if you're doing streets throughout different areas of your city, you definitely want to have separate activities for each of those streets or combination of streets that you're doing. Also, public services. You don't want to have one public service activity that you're doing all kinds of different services. I mean, sometimes, you know, you can have a public service activity that perhaps does more than one type of service, but you would want to talk with your field office about that. If one is more secondary, then yes, it would probably be okay. But in general, if you're having, you know, different types of public service activities, you want to have those as separate activities. For single unit rehabilitation, it's perfectly fine to have several, you can, you know, aggregate all of your, you can report all of your rehabs under one activity, and there's a place to list all the addresses, so that's okay. Or you can do 1 unit per activity, so that's kind of up to you. But for multi-unit housing rehab, you do have to have a separate activity for each building so that you can properly report your low mod versus if you happen to have non-low mod. For economic development, you want to have a separate activity for each business. This is required by the regulations. And I know we do see that sometimes where people put more than one business in one activity. So if you've done that, you will need to separate those out. So again, 1 business for each activity under economic development. For home ownership assistance, you can do 1 homeowner per activity, or you can aggregate all homeowners for the program year, just like for rehabilitation. That's your option, so you have a choice there. And of course, if you're doing something that is to prevent, prepare for, or respond to the coronavirus, you will make sure that you have a separate activity if you're using, if you're also doing an activity that is not in response to coronavirus. You don't want to combine those 2 things. What you can do is if you have an activity to respond to coronavirus and you're using regular CDBG money for that and CV money, it is allowable to use to do those together if it's the exact same activity. You can put those together in the same activity if you would like and answer the question yes for respond to coronavirus, or you can have them separately. But we definitely don't want you to combine anything where it's not in response to coronavirus and something else that is in response to coronavirus. A few years ago, there were some additional matrix codes added for housing counseling. And so this is a little bit confusing. I really encourage you to read the matrix code definitions that are in that are on the HUD Exchange and in the appendix of the IDI's manual. But there's several different housing counseling definitions several different matrix codes under the housing counseling, especially for, you know, if it meets the 24 CFR 5.100 housing counseling definition. And so you do need to report housing counseling in that case under a separate activity. And so there is the B.5.1, which supports B.5.R. There is the 13A supporting 13B. There's the 14L, which is in conjunction with CDBG assisted housing rehab. And there's the 14K, which is in conjunction with home assisted housing activities. And then there's housing counseling only, B.5.U. And then finally, there's an B.5.X, which is when it doesn't necessarily meet the definition under 24 CFR 5.100, but you're just doing housing information and referral services. So read that over and make sure that you understand that. The B.5.Y is the counseling that's supporting home buyer down payment assistance. B.5.R is the actual home buyer down payment assistance. And that's as a public service. And then you have your 13A and 13B, and 13A is the counseling when providing homeowner assistance, and 13B is the direct homeownership assistance under low mod housing. So again, it's a little bit confusing, but read over those different codes if you do housing counseling to make sure that you are putting it in the proper, under the proper matrix code. So your data or your accomplishments has to be reported at least at the end of each program year. So at the minimum, you need to report accomplishments before you, at the end of your year in preparation for your CAPER, so that you can show HUD what you've done during the year. But HUD does recommend more frequent data entry. And as we'll show you a little bit later with the flags, if you don't put information in more frequently, sometimes you do get flags. So it's really encouraged in some cases to do quarterly reporting, particularly maybe for public services where you're assisting a lot of people every quarter. Sometimes people will update the system with accomplishments twice a year, but you know, at least once a year is what you're required to do. So HUD does have a flag feature to help improve program oversight. This was started several years ago, and flags can say that it can maybe signal that there's a problem. It doesn't necessarily mean that you've done anything wrong. It's just more of a monitoring system to help HUD and you see perhaps something that maybe needs attention. And so there's 3 types of flags for CDBG. There's activities that have had no draws for a year, and that kind of indicates that maybe something's stalled. And so that's why there's that flag. There's also flags for activities with no reported accomplishments after 3 years. And of course, that's also a little bit of a concern, because why has there been nothing reported for accomplishments for 3 years? And then the last one is activities that have had 80% of their funding dispersed, but no accomplishments reported. So again, these are just 3 monitoring things that can indicate issues. They aren't necessarily saying that there's a problem, but it can indicate a problem. So when you're reviewing your at-risk activities, these are going to be applied to the activities automatically by the system, but there is a warning message that comes before the flag becomes active. So you do get a little bit of time for a warning saying if you don't do a draw or put in accomplishments or something like that, you're going to be getting a flag. So if you get a warning flag, then it's not an active flag. And as long as you do whatever, you were possibly going to get the flag for, if you do a drawdown or if you put in accomplishments, then as long as it's a warning, then that flag's going to go away and that's the end of it. But if it becomes active, it's an active flag, then that's where the grantee must provide a remediation plan for the activity within 3 months. And the field office then should review that remediation plan within 3 months. And again, these are meant to be management tools, not necessarily compliance tools. It's just a way to help alert you and help alert your HUD office of perhaps issues that may be happening. So each at-risk activity requires a remediation plan. And again, if it's just a warning message and it's not an active flag, then you don't have to do a remediation plan. You can just either do a drawdown if that's needed, or enter accomplishments if that can be done, or perhaps the activity can be completed, and that's fine. If you complete an activity, then it will disappear as well from the warning message. But once it becomes active, then you do enter a remediation plan. It's not that big of a deal to do in the system. You have to just say the reasons for your delay, the action plan to resolve the delay. So not too long of a narrative. You're going to describe what you're going to do, what steps are you going to take to resolve the issue, and the timeline for completing that action plan. And you have up to 6 months to complete that action plan. But if you can complete the activity, or if that activity was never really used, you never did any drawdowns, and you just want to cancel it, then you can cancel it. And then once you either complete or cancel an activity, the remediation plan is not needed, because that activity will disappear from the flag list. So again, remediation plans are just short-term actions to move a stalled activity, if that's what it is, forward, or resolve the delay if that's, if it's been a delay. And you're also going to be providing just a timeline for what you're going to be doing. If it's something to do with a drawdown, you're going to just talk about how or when you're going to be doing that additional drawdown, or when you're going to be reporting accomplishments, or when you expect to complete the activity. And the activity doesn't necessarily have to be completed within that 6-month period. But just so you know, if once you submit a remediation plan, and once HUD approves that remediation plan, you cannot edit a remediation plan. And then the next step, of course, is to say that you have confirmed the remediation actions have been taken. But we get a very common question through the Ask a Question where both perhaps you or the grantee or the field office wants to update the remediation plan, make a change to it. But once it's been approved by HUD, it cannot be edited. But that's okay. You can always agree outside of the system any changes that you want to do. That's perfectly fine. And we recognize that the system doesn't allow changes to the remediation plan. Just know that once you've submitted it and once HUD approves it, it can't be changed. Now, if the grantee submits a remediation plan and before HUD has a chance to approve it, you want to make a change to that, you can update and make some kind of a change to it. But once it's been approved, then it is set in stone. There's a report you can run, the PR59 report, which shows the at-risk activities, and your field office probably will be running those reports from time to time to see what's going on, you know, and to see, because if they see that there's at-risk activities, then they're going to want to make sure that you're addressing that problem, if that's a problem. So that's what this looks like. And there's also some resources available for the whole flagging and at-risk procedure. There's these are the addresses, and then I'll show you at the end where you go. But there's also frequently asked questions that talk about the flag system and the remediation plans. And also, of course, you can always ask a question if you have a specific question that you want to ask for yourself. So now we're going to talk about a little bit about some reports. There's several listed here, but really the ones we're going to look at are just the PR26 for regular and CDBG and CV. And then we're going to look at the cash on hand report, which when you submit and run the report is the PR29. So really those are the two we're going to focus on next, but this is just a list of some common reports that are used for CDBG program. So the cash on hand quarterly report is relatively new. It's been around for about 1.5 years or so. And most recently, there is now a CDBG CV portion of that report. And so HUD wants you to report those funds separately. So if you have drawdown privileges, you will see the cash on hand submission link on the left-hand side of your menu bar when you're on the grant screen. You'll also see a little red number 1 or number 2 that shows that you have a cash on hand report due, and that will help alert you to that. This report is taking the place of the 425 previously that you had done, and you're going to be reporting all of your federal funds and also your local funds, your program income and revolving loan funds to HUD for each quarter. Now, one of the very frequent questions that we get about this report is the fact that now when you do this in the system, you can never have a negative number on either line 1, cash on hand at the beginning of the reporting period, or line 16, I'm sorry, or line 6, cash on hand at the end of the reporting period. And frequently, grantees, before they used this feature of IDIS, they were reporting negative numbers. Well, it turns out you really shouldn't be reporting negative numbers. And the reason is this. This is supposed to reflect the cash that you have that are CDBG funds. And it's not a reflection of when you advance your own general funds for an expense before you've had a chance to reimburse yourself from IDIS. And so because of that, you wouldn't have negative funds, because the negative is really just the fact that you've advanced some of your general funds to pay invoices and pay your subrecipients and so forth. And now you're coming to IDIS to reimburse yourself. because of that, you're not going to ever have a negative amount at the beginning of the reporting period. It's always going to be, as you know, unless you do draw your funds before you've spent them. And of course, you know, you do have to follow the rules about spending your money within the reasonable time period. But unless you draw the funds first, you're not going to have any cash on hand at the beginning or end of the reporting period, because your reporting period is just going to reflect the draws that you made during that quarter. And that's one of the reasons that they added this feature that says amount of disbursements calculated by IDIS from the beginning through the end of the reporting period. That's a handy little feature that tells you, well, this is what you drew down during that quarter. And if you always work on a reimbursement basis, then that should reflect what you would put down as your disbursements and also the funds you received. So some of the things that you'll be thinking about when you do the PR29 report is, first of all, have you complied with the requirements at 2 CFR 200.305 regarding federal payments? This is the, the general circular about using federal funds. And a lot of that is regarding the fact that you need to use your program income before you're using your grant funds. So any kinds of local funds that you have, program income or refunds or credits, you always have to use those before drawing down your treasury funds. Have you been entering your program income and revolving loan funds into IDIS? Do you have a large cash balance? Well, if you have a large cash balance of federal funds, that's a problem. And if you have a large cash balance of program income, that could indicate a problem if you haven't been using it first, or if it's a large cash balance because you have a large revolving loan fund, is the problem that your revolving loan fund not really active, that you're not really, you're getting lots of money into it, but you're not spending money out of it. So all of these are concerns that, and the things that, types of things that HUD looks at when they look at your cash on hand report. And the data must be consistent from quarter to quarter as well. Because, you know, just like if we go backwards here, let me just go back. So for example, the cash on hand that you would have at the end of the reporting period, line 6, for example, and also you have program income on line 11, then that should equal then for the next quarter, the cash on hand at the beginning of the reporting period. And I do know that a lot of grantees had asked a question, well, we were doing it incorrectly and we had a negative amount, so now our new total is different. Well, if it's not matching the previous quarter, just make sure you add some narrative in there. There's a place for remarks, and explain that to your HUD office of why your beginning balance is not what it was at the ending balance of the previous quarter. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the PR26 CDBG financial summary report. And there are instructions on the HUD Exchange. There's also information in the HUD trainings on the HUD Exchange, on the CDBG IDIS trainings on the HUD Exchange. There's a section about financial reporting, and there's a really good description, and it really goes into a lot of detail for the PR26. So between these resources, there's a wealth of information to help you with this report if you need it, because it is kind of a complicated report. And this report has 5 sections. The first is the summary of all of your CDBG resources. The second section is the summary of all of your CDBG expenditures. The third part is the low mod benefit test. The fourth part is the public service cap calculation. And finally, the last part is the planning and administration cap calculation. So we're going to look at each of these separately. So the first part is your summary of your resources, and line 1 is the one thing that you do have to enter into IDIS, because that line is not automatically generated by the system. So there's a section in IDIS where you have to go where it says edit parameters for the PR26. It's on the report screen when you first click on the reports menu. And that's where you have to go in and add a new year, add a new program year, and then enter your line 1. And I can just say that I see lots and lots of PR26 reports that the grantee hasn't entered line 1. And if you don't enter line 1, then your lines at the end will show you your line 16 is not going to be the correct unexpended balance at the end of your program year because you haven't included all your unexpended funds from the previous year. So your line 1 is all your undrawn CDBG funds that were left over from your prior year. Now, it doesn't mean they're not committed. They may be perfectly all committed in activities, but anything that's not been drawn is going to be reported on line 1. And then this the rest of it automatically is included. It will report your entitlement grant, any program income that you received during that year will be reported. And then there are adjustment lines if needed. And if you need to make adjustments, you do want to make sure you follow the instructions in the report. So your line 8 is your total available funds. Now, the next section is your summary of your expenditures. And again, this section is all completely generated by the system. And it just takes all of your expenditures and reports it, and it separates it by your planning and admin expenditures, which is on line 12, and all of your other disbursements that were on line 9. And then it also reports of that amount, how much has been is subject to low mod benefit, which would be your project costs. And then it gives you your total expenditures. And finally, on line 16 is your unexpended balance. Now, if everything is correct, then your unexpended balance at the end of your program year is going to be the number you use for line 1 of your following year, because that's what's carried over into the next year. The third part is your low mod benefit calculation. Now, if you don't use a multi-year certification, then the system automatically calculates this for you. It shows all of your expenditures for low mod activities. And then it calculates the percent to make sure that you've achieved at least 70% low mod. We do want to mention here that if you have funds that have been expended for low mod housing in special areas or expended for low mod multi-unit housing, then there's going to be information on the details section of the report, the following, the pages after the first page, and you will have to enter those amounts yourself on the edit parameters screen. Also, sometimes this section doesn't report all the low mod activities properly if you're using a strategy area for a target area. So we just want to kind of caution you, there's a little bit of a glitch in the report where it really should be, but it isn't. So what we recommend is that if this isn't reporting all the activities properly as low mod, then, and you may not have 100% low mod, but if it's way below what you think it should be, then it very well might have to do with either having activities that you need to enter information on line 17 or 18, or it could be about having an activity set up in a strategy area. But of course, you can always send it and ask a question if you're not sure how to figure this out. Now, if you use a multi-year certification, and not everyone does, but if in your certifications each year with your action plan, you state whether you're using a 1, a 2, or a 3-year certification period. And a lot of grantees don't quite understand this, but you don't have to use a multi-year certification period. That would just be if you want to average your low mod percent over more than 1 year, because maybe you're going to be doing a lot of urgent need or slum and blight activities 1 year, and you're afraid you're not going to meet your 70%, but it's only going to be a 1-year focus, and then you'll be doing much more low mod the following years. Then you can average your low mod percent over a period of 2 or 3 years to achieve that minimum 70%. So if you are using a multi-year certification, then you do need to enter some information in lines 23 through 26. Actually, 26 is calculated, but on line 23, you need to enter the years covered in your certification, and then you need to enter information in line 24 and 25. The next section is public services, and this, again, the system automatically will generate this information from your public service activities. So if it's not looking like it's correct, then it could have something to do with the way the activity is set up. Maybe you use the wrong matrix code, and so it's reporting something as a public service that shouldn't be, or maybe it's not reporting something as a public service that should be. So a lot of times when this doesn't seem to be looking correct, it could be something to do with how you set up the activity. So we encourage you to review that. It calculates it includes the program income from the prior year because that's part of your public service cap calculation. And then it calculates the percent obligated for public service activities. Now this section has 2 lines. It has a line for public services unliquidated obligations at the end of your current program year. So that's where you can enter if you are not going to be, if you haven't spent all the public service funds. And if you're going to be spending it in the next 90 days, you can always mark your voucher as prior year. It will be included and you won't have to do unliquidated obligations. But if you think that those funds won't be included in the next 90 days, or if you just would prefer to do it as unliquidated obligations and not use the prior year feature, then that's where you can enter that and it will add that into your total. And then line 29 is where you put the amount from the previous year that was on line 28. And so if you're not sure how to use that feature, then we recommend that you look at the instructions. One thing we want to show you is that this is the detail page that follows the report. And so line 27 is your public services detail. And because of the CV program, well, actually because of the CARES Act and everything, you are allowed to use your regular CDBG funds in response to coronavirus. So even though there's a separate PR26 for CV, and we're not looking at that one right now, we're only looking at the regular one. But what now, because you can use your 19 and 20 funds in response to coronavirus from your regular CDBG, this now subtotals anything. It shows any activities where you answered the question yes to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus. And then it subtotals those amounts so that you know how much you spent of your 19 to 20 funds in response to coronavirus. And then we want you to enter that on line 30. So line 30 is an adjustment line, and that's where you can enter that as a negative amount so that it's subtracted off to show that you are under the 15%. So most of the field offices are letting grantees know that they want you to enter that adjustment so that they can clearly see that you met the 15% or you didn't exceed the 15% cap as long as you weren't using funds for coronavirus. So again, this is that detail that you'll see on the line 27 detail. Here's the section for the planning and administration cap. And this section also has the same couple lines for unliquidated obligations. So if you have unliquidated obligations for planning administration, perhaps you have a purchase order for something that's back ordered and you couldn't get it in time before the end of your program year, but you've obligated those funds, or you have some contracts for something that is being paid out of planning and admin but hasn't been fully spent out. That's where you can put that on line 38 to include it in your total costs for the year. And then if you do use line 38, then the following year you would enter that same amount on line 39, which will subtract it from the total so that it isn't counted twice. There's also, in this section, it reports the current year's program income because that's what's used to calculate your maximum cap for planning administration. It counts your grant amount plus your program income from the current year. And there also are adjustment lines in here if that information is also needed. There's a relatively newer report called the PR26 Activity Summary by Selected Grant Report. And this is helpful also to see about your planning and admin cap because there are now 2 tests of the planning and administration cap since grant-based accounting started in 2015. There are now 2 tests. And so this report shows all of the funds that, and actually this is a 2014 example. It was probably not that good of an example because you want to use this for 15 and later. You don't really want to use this for 14. But this is where you can see how much of your specific year's grant funds you've spent towards planning and admin, because there's a rule now that for each year, 15 and later, you cannot spend more than 20% of those treasury funds, those grant EN funds, or AD if you use that. You can't use more than 20% of that for planning and administration. So this is a little bit of a complicated chart, so I don't expect you to really be able to understand it exactly. But what we're trying to show here is a little bit about the two different caps for planning and administration. So the first one is the obligation, and the second one is the origin year test. So for the obligation test, which is the test that has been around forever, and everybody should know that, that says that of your total entitlement grant that you received that year and all the program income that you received during that year, of that total, you cannot spend more than 20% of that for planning and administration, or spend or obligate. So obligations are really, it's obligations, but it's what you spend and obligations if you have those. Now with grant-based accounting, there's now what's called an origin year test or a grant source year test. And what that means is that for any year, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and on, of those year funds, you cannot spend more than 20% for planning and administration. So if you do receive program income, what that means is that you just need to make sure that you at least spend some of that program income for planning and administration if you intend to use, take advantage of the fact that program income gives you more planning and administration dollars. So you can't just spend, if you have a lot more money you can use because of program income, you can't just spend all that out of your entitlement funds, or you're going to exceed your other cap, your grant, your source year cap. I do see we're getting close to the end, and we have there's been a lot of material to cover, but let me just go over just a couple more things. This is a snapshot of the PR26 CDBG CV financial summary. It's a much shorter report. There's no line 1. You don't have to enter anything on line 1. It's a cumulative report. It updates as you do draws. It will continue to update. And there shouldn't be really any, other than if you spend money in for low mod housing in special areas, or if you spend money for low mod multi-unit housing. Other than those two situations, you probably won't need to put any, or there won't be any adjustment lines available for you to use for this report. And you will want to submit this report each year with your CAPER, but again, it will keep updating as you spend your CV money. And then finally, when you've completely expended your CV money, you'll submit a final report of this PR26 version. So this is a list of some of the resources that we have for the CDBG program. This is just part of what's available. And I want to show you also one other thing, but I'm going to go over to the questions. And let's see. So here you should see now, this is the HUD Exchange, and these are the IDIS resources for the CDBG program. There's manuals and guidance, screenshots, and trainings. And also there's IDIS training for CDBG grantees. And if you see here, this is where on the this is the landing page on the HUD Exchange, and there's all kinds of training videos that are available here now. And they go into specific different types of activities, housing activities. It talks about low mod national objective, low mod area national objective, low mod clientele national objective. It even has information about reporting on accomplishments for each of these. And then finally, it has financial information, financial reports. So this is very helpful as well for any kinds of help that you need. You can go to these kinds of resources. So at the very end, and I don't think we have any time for questions. Laura, do you have, I'm sorry that we went so long, but do you
No,
see any?
we've been
Yes.
answering a few of them in the question and answer section.
Oh, great.
And so I think there's a few here. One might be that we can answer is that if a grantee is not able to complete their remediation plan by the proposed date, the 6-month deadline, should they just mark it as complete and talk with their HUD field office?
Well, that's a very good question. And I wouldn't say that you should mark it as complete. So there's a place after you do a remediation plan, you have to, then there's a point where you should be able to confirm that you did the remediation action, but you shouldn't just say that you did it just to get rid of the flag. So if you haven't done what you said you were going to do for the remediation, you should just leave it. And because we don't encourage you to do that. But you should just definitely speak with your field office and just be in touch with them. That's okay if it's still showing as a on the flag list. That's all right, as long as you're in touch with your field office and you know that you are working together on what you're going to be doing to resolve the flag.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah. So the answer was especially nope, don't.
Right. Don't confirm just to get rid of that flag. Right.
Right. And before we're totally out of time, it might be a good time to just mention, I think you saw the resource for all the questions about IDIS setup. Make sure you do look at the IDIS guide for entitlement communities because there are a lot of different specific setup instructions that go through on chapters 3 and 4 specifically.
Yep.
And
okay. Well, I think we're at time, so thank you so much for joining. And again, if you have further questions, you can always submit them to the IDIS Ask a Question.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Susan. And please stick around for the next session at 11:15 on financial management. That concludes our session on IDIS.
Again, thank you, Rob and Susan and Laura. And that is correct. We will be ending this current live stream and we will join back on at 11:15 a.m. Eastern Time for financial management. And again, thank you, Susan, Laura, and Rob for taking us through all that wonderful IDIS information in such a short time. Have a good day, everybody.